The period right after the collapse of the Soviet Union was on the whole a period of great optimism for the West. Most of the Eastern Bloc had just turned democratic, they were establishing free markets, and they were now seeking cooperation and even integration into the West. The great enemy of the West, the Soviet Union, had fallen, and there were now also hopes that this new Russia would be capable of steering a course of democracy and cooperation with the West, after which all of Europe would be united under the joint banners of NATO and the European Union. Meanwhile, with the disappearance of the Soviet Union, America now stood as the sole superpower in the world, and a short period of time, sometimes referred to as the end of history, has begun. This period is generally described as lasting from 1991 to 2003, and in these years it wasn't an uncommon idea that the path to worldwide democracy and liberalism had now been painted with the victory over the Soviet Union. After all, monarchism, fascism, and now communism had all been triumphed over by the liberal West. But, as we all know, this is not what happened. While Russia, during these years, was largely preoccupied with their post-breakup issues, China began their meteoric rise to prominence. At the same time, America alienated many nations in the world by their controversial interventions all over the world, the most significant of which was Iraq. With the invasion of Iraq in 2003, justified by the non-existent weapons of mass destruction that Iraq supposedly had, America had implicitly announced to the entire world that no autocrat was now safe. It was very well possible that America could invade your nation next if they decide it to be a threat to the liberal world order. So, the period of the single superpower and American world hegemony came to an end after only a short period of existence. By the 2000s, China had built itself up as a massive economic powerhouse, increasingly capable of replacing the West as a worldwide economic bloc, especially for the more authoritarian nations. During the same time, Putin took over as the leader of Russia. Helped along by Putin, Russia entered into a new period of revival. The economic hardships of the 90s were over as Russia's GDP doubled in the span of a decade. But Russia is a different beast to China altogether for the West to deal with. Where China, for now, is first and foremost a threat to economic interest and soft power all over the world, Russia has a far more assertive stance on their direct surrounding nations. And this makes sense, as Russia's influence within a decade's time had declined from having indirect control or influence over about half of Europe and significant parts of Asia to just holding on to Russia proper, while many of Russia's former satellite states entered into partnership with the West. But under Putin, this was going to change, as Russia once again found the strength to assert itself on the world stage, and did so with a mix of military force and by strengthening political partnerships with the surrounding nations. The immediate focus was on the post-Soviet states, mainly by supporting pro-Kremlin politicians within these nations, increasing political and economic cooperations between these nations, and when all else fails, even assisting or starting separatist conflicts to keep these nations away from any NATO ties. And this leads us to today, where an increasingly desperate Russia has now launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine to prevent Ukraine from moving further and further away from the Kremlin's influence. So what if this changed? What if instead of Russia going into the 21st century on their own, the feelings of optimism that came with the end of the Cold War culminated in a radical decision, both from Russia and the European Union. As the European Union expanded rapidly eastwards, especially with the 2004 enlargements, which included most of the former Soviet satellite states in Eastern Europe, a radical idea is proposed by Russia. What if the Europeans actually let Russia join the European Union at the same time as the other former Eastern Bloc nations? Just to be clear, this is not a fundamentally different Russia to the Russia of our timelines 2004. This is Putin's Russia that would be let into the Union. This would immediately throw off any prior negotiations with the Eastern European states. One of the main reasons the former Eastern Bloc was allowed to join so rapidly was because it would provide a kind of informal protection from Russia, as it was feared that explosive NATO expansion would antagonize the Russians too much. Now, this year of 2004 is very significant by being the most realistic date for Russia's membership even being considered. Immediately following the collapse of the Soviet Union, the European Union didn't even exist yet. And when they did come into existence in 1992, they were largely preoccupied with the new integration of East Germany. After that, a couple of smaller, developed democracies were allowed to join: Sweden, Finland and Austria. But there was no idea of further expansion during the 90s, as both the European Union and the democracies and economies of the Eastern Bloc were still in their infancy. Europe didn't have the willpower nor the institutions to let the Eastern Bloc in yet. Only in 2004, after a decade of the Eastern Europeans consistently asking the European Union for membership, and pretty direct American support for this as well, did the European Union reluctantly allow the expansion. So, discussing Russian membership into the European Union before 2004 simply wouldn't work, as if the European Union is not ready to accept Poland into the Union, they most certainly aren't ready to allow Russia into the Union. But despite this being the most realistic date for Russia to join the Union, realistically, there is still no chance that this would actually happen in 2004. While the new members of 2004 in our own timeline failed to meet many of the official EU requirements for membership, Russia would break most of them. Russia is not a full democracy, with many reported and alleged issues with their elections and their government. Russia's economy and their government was also riddled with corruption, as a few oligarchs consolidated the post-Soviet economy and formed a new upper class, holding most of the industries and important government positions. At the same time, Russia was upholding a separatist regime in Transnistria while they were still fighting a rebellion in their own territory of Chechnya. But perhaps most importantly, Russia would easily become the biggest European country if they joined. Not just in terms of land area, although Russia itself is 4 times the size of the European Union, and as such would account for 80% of the Union's landmass, but most importantly, in terms of population. Russia by itself would have a larger population than France and Germany, the 2 giants of the European project, combined. Russia would have about a quarter of the population of the European Union, bringing the total to about 600 million people inside the Union. This would undoubtedly make Russia the single most powerful nation within the European Parliament. Now, we can do 2 things here. We can either completely change Russia, turn them into a model democracy, and remove their corruption before we let them enter the Union. But I think it would be more interesting if we let Russia, as we know it in our own 2004, enter the European Union, and see where the scenario goes from there. So, we will let the European Union look past all the issues and decide we can fix Russia if we let them in. So, somewhere in late 2004, the entire world is shocked, as the announcement is made that most of the former Eastern Bloc will join the European Union, including Russia itself. And these first years would be a strange mix of worldwide optimism and European skepticism. The Cold War now seemed decidedly over, and on the surface it seemed that Russia had now chosen democracy over autocracy, and over time Russia's many issues would be ironed out. The West would immediately start thinking about NATO expansion, while at the same time Europe itself would enter a period of internal strife. While the new nations would be excited about the economic growth that came with joining the Union had just increased their population by 50%, and Western skepticism for the Union would increase, as now not just the 40 million Poles have access to the Western European job market, the 140 million Russians do as well. While economically, this would be a big boost for both Western and Eastern Europe, in the West, new social issues would emerge out of fears of migration by the Eastern Europeans. And this new status quo would last for about 4 years. Russia's economy would boom, as European knowledge and companies enter the country. The exploitation and the export of Russian raw resources to Europe is massively intensified when compared to our own timeline, giving Russia an even larger share of the European energy market than they have had in our own timeline. For both Russia and the European Union, the partnership is incredibly lucrative, as with Russia included, the European Union is suddenly a lot more self-reliant in terms of raw materials and energy. But internally, Russia hasn't fundamentally changed. The same oligarchs reap the majority of the benefit, and Putin's popularity skyrockets as he brings even more economic prosperity to Russia. Don't think that just because Russia is allowed into the European Union, they suddenly get rid of corruption and become a well-behaved model democracy. Over time, Russia and the European Union would be embroiled in a constant struggle where Russia claims it is plenty democratic enough, while the European Union accuses Russia of backsliding further and further into a dictatorship. But there is a more radical event that could completely kill Western optimism that Russia will fully integrate into the Western world order if it still happens in this alternate timeline. In the haste with which Russia was added into the Union, the West just assumed that Russia would now follow the Western international course. They assumed that in due time Russia would join NATO as well, and the European Union and NATO would slowly but steadily encompass all of Europe. But for Russia, the European Union and NATO are two completely separate institutions. The European Union is a European economic and political partnership. NATO is an American military partnership from the Cold War era, which is very much still seen as an anti-Russian organization. So in the West, and mainly in Europe, many questions would be raised about the real benefit to NATO, as NATO skepticism would have massively increased with the Russian accession into the European Union. But the expansion of NATO would still remain a goal for mainly America, while within Russia, NATO would be seen as a completely obsolete organization, with no real reason to exist or expand anymore. So, when it is declared in 2006 and 2008 that NATO wants to expand to include Ukraine and Georgia, Putin would still oppose this just as vividly as he did in our own timeline, calling on the successful European diplomatic partnership as the way forward for Europe, instead of expanding Cold War-era military pacts. Who is NATO even still targeting? Russia is an ally to Europe, right? Then who do Ukraine and Georgia need protection from? A much larger rift is created between European and Russian populations on the one side and America on the other, as many Europeans and Russians feel like America is needlessly antagonizing Russia once again. Especially with Russia now in the European Union, they would have a lot more success spreading their narrative deeper into Europe. And here we have the main issue that the West completely forgot about when they allowed Russia to join the European Union. Russia is not Germany. Russia is not simply content with internal focus. Russia is the largest nation in the world. They have the fastest growing economy in Europe. They have the largest army in Europe. They are the most important energy provider to Europe. Yet even still, the West is treating it as a now unimportant regular member of the West. But Putin wouldn't play ball, and he would stand just as firm on future NATO expansion so close to Russia as he did in our own timeline. And suddenly, Russia would send the entire European Union into complete chaos and crisis. Russia has just launched an invasion of Georgia. The European Union really doesn't have any protocol for this. An attack on an EU member has some protocol, assuming the EU member isn't also a member of NATO, with the main points being trying to find a diplomatic solution, starting committees, and a vague giving support to the nation being attacked. But in terms of an EU member going to war against a third party, there is really nothing legally stopping it. So Europe would never recover from this alternate 2008, even if Russia doesn't actually invade Georgia. The European population becomes increasingly divided between the majority opinion that American partnership is more important than the Russian one, and the expansion of NATO is justified under the principle of self-determination. After all, if Russia isn't planning to invade Georgia or Ukraine, there should be no issue with them joining NATO, right? But on the other hand, we would have an increasingly large section of Europeans, especially in Western Europe, who would start to see Russia as the victim. America had unjustly invaded Iraq and is now antagonizing our ally of Russia for no real reason by expanding NATO. But this crisis by itself may be solvable for Europe. But let's add even more fuel to the fire. The 2008 financial crisis had just entered into its full swing. European companies, banks, and most importantly nations start to collapse economically. The first round of hardships were just the general economic fallout of the crisis itself. But Europe was hit even harder than most thanks to the way the European financials work, with many of the European Union nations tied together with one single currency of the euro and one single European-wide financial institution overseeing the many separate budgets and economies of the Eurozone. Nations in Southern Europe started reporting that they were unable to repay their outstanding debt and their budget deficits were huge. But since they were part of the Eurozone, they were extremely limited in how they could respond to any financial difficulty, as much of the financial autonomy is taken away from the individual states and given to that European-wide financial institution. But at the same time, even if the relatively small Greece were to collapse economically, this would likely cause devastating ripple effects for every single other nation in the Eurozone. So, Europe is now dealing with the economic fallout of the financial collapse at the same time as the two political crises of Russian democratic backslide and Russian aggression on the world stage. But the worst part for the European Union? Any solution has to be agreed upon by Russia, as Russia would essentially hold much of the European institutions and economy hostage. In the European Parliament, Russians would hold about 20% of the total amount of seats. These would not all be Putin's allies, but many of them would be. Combine these with the many far-right and even far-left voters who would be sympathetic to Russia over America. A significant portion of the European Parliament would be Russian sympathetic at the very least. But that's not even the worst of it. Many other institutions are based on the right of the individual nations to veto proposals that they don't like. Any proposal that needs a full majority can get instantly shut down by Russia. But sometimes a full majority is not needed. Some decisions and institutions need what is known as a qualified majority. But even here, Russia has outscaled influence, as with their 25% of Europe's population, they would be the single most important nation in votes where the qualifying majority must have 65% of the population of the Union. But what would probably be even more devastating for any European action against Russia at this point would be Russia's economic influence. European economies are struggling all around, and Russia would probably supply Europe with more than 30% of their energy at this point. If Russia were to tamper with this energy supply now, in the middle of an economic and political meltdown, Europe would be in big trouble. At the same time, Russia's economy is recovering much faster than Europe's, especially as the Euro crisis starts, since Russia would not have joined the Eurozone yet. This economic influence would be the death knell for the European Union. There are steps that they could take to reduce Russian influence, mainly by invoking Article 7 to suspend Russian member rights. But with Russia holding such ideological, political, and economic power over the other members, it is quite likely that this never gets through the European political framework. And for everyone who doubts this, just look at Hungary today. As a relatively small nation, a minor economy, and a troubled democracy, the European Union largely fails in decisively handling the Hungarian issue. Now, place this issue a decade earlier with a less defined European Union against the single largest and most important European Union member. So, would Europe be able to deal with this? I very much doubt it. In our own timeline, the Euro crisis pushed Europe to its absolute limits before they reached a conclusion to the financial issues largely helped by America. Now, with Russia inside the Union, I only see massive radicalization on the horizon for Europe. In our timeline, American intervention was crucial in helping the European Union recover after 2008, but with Russia inside the Union, America wouldn't be capable of providing any more support than Russia allows it to. And Russia is more than fine with a partially dysfunctional European Union. So the popularity for the European project would take a nosedive. The European Union is, even more than our own timeline, completely unable to reach consensus or to solve a crisis in a satisfying manner. During the first years of the 2010s, Euroscepticism reaches an all-time high, while some Eastern European nations start to fall back into more authoritarian regimes, aligning themselves slightly more closely to Putin inside the Union. Expect the United Kingdom to vote to leave the Union with a much more decisive majority early in the 2010s, as the European Union itself is now seen as a shell of its former self, just a vehicle for advancing Russian interests into Europe. This fall would be completely unprecedented, and how it would happen cannot be predicted. But during the 2010s and the 2020s, the European Union would slowly be eroded and replaced with smaller interstate cooperations. The first domino to fall would likely be the United Kingdom, but then others would follow. Nations like Greece, Czechia, France and Italy have very big anti-European sentiments and political parties in our own timeline, which would only be massively bolstered in this alternate scenario. Expect anti-European parties to come to power in many of these nations and to slowly start to push for these nations to exit the now dysfunctional union. Russia itself, however, would stay, and with every nation that leaves the union, Russia would become more and more dominant. With Italy, France and the UK likely to leave, Russia would come closer and closer to holding 50% of the population of the Union. But it's not just the European Union itself that feel the effects of the collapse of the European project. Many nations in the Balkans and Eastern Europe, despite not being members of the Union yet, are held to much higher accounts by their populations thanks to the economic wealth that will come by joining the Union in the future. Countries like Moldova, Albania, Macedonia, Ukraine and more are not perfect democracies, but they are mostly trending upwards in the democracy scale as their population is looking forwards to future European Union membership. This dream is shattered in this alternate scenario, and a democratic backslide in these nations is more than possible, as the ruling parties have now lost their incentive to become more democratic and less corrupt. As illiberal democracies and autocracies make a comeback in the less stable European nations, these nations align themselves more closely with Russia and China. Meanwhile, the euro as a currency starts to fall. The financial crisis never quite reaches a satisfying European-wide conclusion, and Southern Europe comes close to immediate financial collapse. Germany would try what it could to help, but simply cannot carry the full burden of the Union on its back. Meanwhile, it is quite likely that America had already lost faith in the European project, and any attempts from America to help the Union as a whole could be easily rebuffed by Russia. Many nations would discuss introducing currencies again on the national level, perhaps at first as joint currencies with the euro, but before the end of the decade, the euro would have largely fallen into irrelevancy. Whatever is left of the European Union in the 2020s cannot be taken seriously. With France, Italy and the United Kingdom leaving, much of the backbone of Europe would be gone. Perhaps the Union never officially disbands, but by the start of the 2020s, the European Union would have lost all respect and authority within Europe. At the same time, the European economies are absolutely devastated by first the economic crash, then the euro crisis, and then the slow disbanding of the European Union. Eastern Europe would be hit hardest by this, as their economies are less developed, but Western Europe is also reduced to a close to irrelevant status on the world stage. Many treaties between individual nations would have taken the place of the European Union. Nations like the Benelux would work together closely, Ireland and the UK would attempt to sort out their differences, likely with American arbitration, and Europe would once again become a battlefield of interests. Germany would be the economic center of this new Europe, attempting to remain the link between the East and the West by holding good relations with both America and Russia and their respective spheres of influence. Much of democratic Western Europe would return to close cooperation with America, as many nations in the East would cautiously return to cooperation with the Russians. Nations in Southern Europe would be hit hardest by the economic issues and would simply support the highest bidder, likely balancing Chinese and American alliances. The United Kingdom would attempt to become a global powerhouse again, mainly by seeking ties with their former settler colonies. But, thanks to the great distance, these wouldn't do much to restore the UK to a position of global prominence. Finally, France would attempt to consolidate their control over West Africa, but West Africa is already trying to move away from French influence in our own timeline, and with the French economy continually declining, it doesn't seem likely that France will be successful in maintaining their influence over West Africa. But in Western continental Europe, France would remain a popular nation, striking deals with nations like Germany, the Benelux, Spain, and Italy. And obviously, all of these changes have insane ramifications all over the globe. Russia has nowhere near the same need to become militarily aggressive as they had in our own timeline. The West has shown its weakness and had broken their unity. Democracy was weakening across Eastern Europe, meaning that nations like Ukraine and Belarus would safely remain within the Russian sphere of autocracies. Russia would have secured its place as the third power in the world, not quite on the same level as China or America, but still significant in their own little neighborhood. Meanwhile, China would likely eclipse America way earlier in this timeline, as many nations in Southern and Eastern Europe drift into the perceived safety of Chinese loans and Chinese economic influence. Then finally, we have America. Still the dominant military force in the world, they would likely still be the number one during the 2020s, but their power would be greatly hurt as their economic ties with Europe are reduced, and most importantly, the largely American-friendly democratic European Union has now collapsed. The democracy and the unity provided by the European Union are now in question in many places. While NATO could still remain in place, and at least Western Europe remains firmly in the American sphere, Europe would be nowhere near a similarly powerful ally as they were in our own timeline. And how this new status quo evolves, I cannot tell you. Perhaps with Russia's local interests secured, America seeks closer cooperation with Russia against China. Perhaps China and Russia continue to work together to continue to pressure the rapidly weakening West. Maybe America forms a new, closer European Union with just Western Europe. Maybe China manages to overcome their upcoming weaknesses and become the definitive great power of the old world as America turns isolationist. I simply can't tell you. But at this point, we stop talking about alternate history and we go into potential futures. The history books about this period would talk about this as an almost inevitable continuation of the collapse of Cold War institutions. They would focus on the need for a big enemy for the Western institutions to function, and without it, there was simply not enough to bind Europe together through the crisis of the 21st century. The history books would say that by allowing Russia to join the European Union, the West essentially signed a death warrant for European cooperation, as NATO, as a military cooperation, no longer had any reason to expand or even exist. This would also be seen as the moment of divergence between Europe and America, with the European Union trying to seek closer cooperation with Russia, while America is unable to let go of their paranoid Cold War era view of Russia. There would also be much discussion about the inevitability of Russia's relapse further and further away from democracy. Many would say that it was inevitable, and bringing Russia into the European Union was a mistake in and of itself, with no possible chance of success, as Russia's leadership was not even remotely ready, or more correctly, willing, to fully become an uncorrupted democracy. A different line of thinking, however, would propose that it was America that ruined any chance for Russia's democracy. By continuing to treat Russia as a threat, by expanding NATO further and further east, America kept aggravating and excluding Russia. American arrogance on the world stage, being unable to accept the fact that Russia, with their huge military, the biggest nuclear arsenal in the world, and their growing economy, wanted to at least remain a secondary power with influence in their neighboring countries, led to the alienation of Russia and thereby indirectly the fall of the European Union. Which one of these is true? Probably the first one. In 2004, Putin was already well on his way to erode any semblance of democracy that Russia had left. The oligarchs had already consolidated control over the economy and the politics of the nation. Many of the nations which had joined the European Union in 2004 were problematic in some way, but Russia had so many red flags that in any realistic scenario, no one would even consider their membership seriously in 2004. But this is where I'll end this quite doomer scenario. Let me know in the comments how you think this scenario goes from here, or tell me what I have gotten wrong. If you liked the video, consider leaving a like and subscribing for more. If you want to support me further and receive benefits like suggesting priority subjects, consider supporting me by becoming a patron or a member on YouTube. Thank you for watching and goodbye.